record it. All right, good. This Zoom account is an education account owned by Clark, so I wasn't quite sure if I could Zoom it on the cloud.
If it's not something you would like to do, that's fine. I was honestly just curious.
No, we always do, so that's great. Okay. We got it. All right, some people are still coming on, so I'll let when you see the bouncing, you know, the little bouncing dots. Yay!
I'll just wait for your cue.
Kate Salmon. Are you related to Kim Salmon? So cool. All right, I think I'm going to get started because I know there's so much good stuff to be sharing today. Welcome again to Trauma Training Tuesday, July COVID edition. We're talking today about the trauma of sexism. And I am really delighted to have two of my sister commissioners here, my dear friends. I have learned so much from both of these women. I'm really looking forward to how much they share with all of you. And their plan for today is that they kind of each have different topics they're going to cover. They're going to switch midway through. And then I think we're hoping to hold questions to the end, but we definitely hope you have questions. I am going to leave it to Mary and Tony to talk a little bit more about what brings them here today, what brings them to this work, because there's so much. I'm going to let them kind of pick some of the amazing things. Both of these women do so many things in the community, you'd be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't. That's how women do things. So again, thank you for being here. Really glad you're here. We want to just let you know about, if you don't already know about the women's commissions, the whole state has a commission, and then there's commissions for every region. So Tony and Mary both serve on the Worcester County Commission. That covers Worcester and many of the surrounding areas. So the intent is to really get good geographic diversity so that we understand the issues for women and girls across the state, as well as professional diversity, many other kinds of diversity we recognize are really important when you're trying to plan, when you're trying to think forward. Both these women are PhDs, also incredibly impressive. So I bring you today Dr. Mary Bridget Burns and Dr. Tonisha Pinckney. And Mary, I don't know if you're going to start us off. Mary's going to start us off. Thank you.
I am. Thank you so much, Amy. You know, Amy and the rest of the commissioners are my biggest cheerleaders, and they got me through that darn dissertation process as a first-gen graduate student. I didn't really know what I was doing, and luckily there are lots of women on the commission who did and kept me going. I was like, this is crazy. What am I doing? This is great. But we're honored to be here, Tony and I, to share our thoughts with you. And so we have some slides to share. I would like you to know that this idea of this topic evolved. So much has happened in the last few weeks in our region, our country, in our society. There's a lot here. We have covered a lot of ground, and I think in a very good way, very manageable way. But all of these things can be, you know, examined in greater depth. I mean, you could spend a whole week on any segment of what we're going to be talking about. So understand that Tony and I could do this all day, gladly, because we believe in these topics. But this is just like trauma of sexism 101. So there's a lot more to be done. But we know you have really good ideas too. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. So our plan, we've got some general sections. We've done our welcome. We're going to do a bit of an introduction so you get to know us a little bit better. Then some slides to give you some information about the topic. We're going to have some call to action because this has to compel us to do something about these issues. And then hopefully a really rich discussion. So welcome again. Thank you, Amy, for your kind words. We are honored to be asked to speak with you today. Amy is our chair. I am glad to serve as co-chair of the commission. If you aren't familiar with the commission, please look us up on Facebook and Twitter. You know, we are trying to represent women and girls from across Worcester County, and that means we need to hear from our constituents and what's happening. I happen to live in southern Worcester County in Sturbridge. I've been here for 8 years, and Toni works across the county, and she'll tell you more about herself in a minute. But we want to get a good representation of everyone and everyone's needs. So I'm going to speak about myself first. I'm going to turn over to Toni. So I'm a researcher and former classroom educator. I taught elementary school, but I've also taught at the college level at Boston College. My husband's Air Force, so I taught a junior college in Western Texas. I've also taught overseas. So I've done a wide variety of teaching. I now am a researcher at a large think tank with offices in Boston, though this is my office now. I hope you don't hear my coworkers. I don't know if any of you have coworkers at home today, but they better stay on the other side of that screen. But they're all doing their best. I'm sure you all are too. Unusual times. So I am quite interested in the role of gender in education and also the things that affect teachers' lives. So in addition to serving on the commission, I'm also a national co-leader of a group called Women Ed US. Women Ed was begun in the UK about 5 years ago and just took off all over the English-speaking world and is now expanding across. And it's just a group of people, totally grassroots, much like the commissions really, talking about education issues as they relate to women. So it's interesting, we learn a lot from each other. And the US system is so complicated compared to a lot of other systems. So that's me, and I'm gonna let Toni introduce herself real quick.
Sure, thank you so much. There is one typo here. I am the visiting assistant professor of criminal justice at Salem State, is also lecturer at a few other institutions. The reason why trauma and sexism is so important to me is because I am a survivor of domestic violence, 8 years of domestic violence, and also a survivor of 4 separate sexual assaults. So the trauma of sexism, not only the daily aspect of it that we go through in the workplace and religion and family and other things that we'll talk about, but also the violence of it. So I am going to talk about a little bit about that today, not my story, but just to give you some context of why I'm so glad to be on this talk today. I have nearly a decade of experience researching and teaching gender, race, crime, and justice courses on the graduate and undergraduate level, but I also teach business courses, accounting, fraud courses, things like that. And I do have over 20 years of experience as a fraud examiner, business advisor, nonprofit consultant, diversity, equity, inclusion, and all of that. So I do a lot of stuff. And I will say all that I've educated myself in and also gained formal education in as also a first generation student is that it's things that I've experienced in my lifetime. So I decided to, instead of just saying, okay, I've experienced it, I want to learn about it, I tried to become an expert or thought leader in some of those areas. So I definitely advocate for racial and gender equity and equality in the justice system, in the mental health systems, and in the educational systems. I am a regional commissioner, as was said earlier, with the Worcester County Commission on the Status of Women. I am a board member, executive committee for the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Massachusetts. I'm also the president-elect of the Worcester Recovery Center and Hospital, and a few other things, including the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. So the work that I do spans a few different states and definitely across Massachusetts. So I'm glad to get started today.
Thank you. Toni is everyone, please look up Toni on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. She's got a website. She's doing amazing work and has several books available on Amazon. So I'll
Yes.
promote you, love, if,
Thank
if you
you.
really great stuff. So without further ado, that's who we are, and this is what we want to talk about today. So this is a quote from the commissioned report from the State Commission here in Massachusetts, and I think we need to sit with it. So we are taking this trauma sexism is something that happened well before COVID. It's something that is ongoing and will continue after, unfortunately. But I think this quote can stand on its own, and COVID is exacerbating. So gender and racial inequalities persist in our society, systems, and institutions. Persist. The public health crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic has served to exacerbate inequalities and the negative impact of discrimination. It was already there. It was already counterproductive, hurtful, traumatizing, and it's just gotten more prevalent. And we're going to talk about why. So this whole thing isn't about COVID, but COVID is making all these things even more visible or more impactful. We're going to look at this in a US context, first at a national level, then here in the Commonwealth, then the Worcester region, and then some personal, not so much our personal stories, but how it affects individual women. So we're looking at this through the lens of women's experiences. You could have a whole discussion on how it affects men, absolutely. And so for the gentlemen on this call, know that we are not ignoring your experiences. There's lots of interesting early studies indicating how men are impacted right now, economically, medically, and so forth. But this is our lens is through the sexism against women. So there's a lot of good research indicating that women are disproportionately at the front in the fight against COVID. And that's impacting societally, labor dynamics, and then the sexism. We're going to draw on data from the Women's Bureau. If you didn't know, the Department of Labor has a Women's Bureau. It's 100 years old this year. I think we need it now more than ever. So we've started as a country talking about how gender sexism in our society has been impacted by COVID and social upheaval, but we haven't always looked at this at a national level. So we're going to draw on that a bit. We're also going to, I got really mad one Saturday, the Saturday before Easter, actually. I was like, I've had it. No one's talking about this. And so I wrote this thing because nurses, teachers, healthcare workers of different kinds, it's women. And what does that mean for us as half of US society? So in terms of medicine, again, this is coming from the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau. I really encourage you to take a look at their very interesting website and the data they have available. We'll make these slides available to Amy and she can distribute them. So as you see here, high percentages of the professionals working in our healthcare system, and this is before COVID, are women. And so with COVID, at this point, you can even just set that aside. We need to acknowledge that we have this is the reality in our healthcare system, that most of these types of workers are women. And the impact of COVID, of course, is that they are the ones fighting this thing. Yes, there are doctors, and many of the doctors are women too, but a disproportionate in relation to our national statistics, are women. The Labor Bureau does not always draw down into regional or racial numbers, and we have found those elsewhere. But just in terms of those raw numbers, it's interesting. So we've got millions of women literally suiting up to fight these issues in our hospitals. If you're in Houston, you are overwhelmed right now. You're facing what we faced in Boston recently. Now, looking at education, if you were to close your eyes and think of a teacher, what does a teacher mean to you? Many of us would think mentally of perhaps our favorite teacher growing up. Maybe we'll think of our children's teachers. Most of those teachers in our mind's eye are probably going to be women. It is ubiquitous in this country that women are teachers, and that there's a long, interesting history as to why that is. It hasn't always been. But the younger the children are, the more likely the educators are to be women. Now, this is different when they become principals and superintendents. It flips. I could go on about that. But as we are shifting in our own educational systems, and as we are trying to think about which path we're going to have to take in the fall in terms of our school systems, and maybe your own children or the children you serve through your work, many of their educators, paraprofessionals, teachers, specialists are women. And what does that mean for us as a society? What's sexism? In my own dissertation research, and there are a few articles here and there, I'm actually working on a research article about this, there is rampant sexism and misogyny and just really uncomfortable work environments. And Tony's working on this through workplace bullying in our schools and against sometimes teachers. And so we need to think about this, because we will potentially have, I think, a lot of people leaving, and by people I mean women, leaving the profession after COVID. I think it's going to be really interesting. We're green and gray. We're green that a lot of our teachers are quite young and inexperienced, just coming out of college. And we're gray because we have a lot of teachers who've hung on for 20, 30 years and they're about to retire. There's not a lot in the middle. And so this is going to be an interesting next few years, I think. Now, the service industry. This is where I think, and in my article I talk about this a little bit, this is where I think that we as a country really, really overlook what's happening. The service industry and those who work in it, waitresses, cashiers, clerks, they drive the economy, right? We are a consumer-based economy. Now, Amazon and others are kind of turning that on its head, but we still are. Who are working in those positions? Women. And we have not talked about that as a society. Women are the people who are serving as housekeeping staff at hospitals and institutions and schools. They're almost 3/4 of all cashiers. They're more than half of restaurant servers. When we're talking about opening up restaurants, opening up stores, when we're talking about just who constitutes our economy, it's women. And how are they being treated? How are they being viewed? Are they being recognized as individuals? The sexism against some of these workers is rampant. I worked in the restaurant industry growing up, and through college, there's a lot of nasty stuff that I experienced. Nothing bad, nothing, no, I wouldn't say any ongoing trauma, but it wasn't okay. But I was almost invisible as a cashier and as a restaurant server. So, and I think this is still the case. When we talk about how are we going to keep things clean, disinfect, well, who's doing that work? I think as a country, we need to have that conversation. And we have the numbers through the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau. Again, it's there, but are we acknowledging it? And what are the impacts of us not acknowledging it? There was a really interesting study through a piece of journalism research through the Boston Globe that perhaps we caught about, I believe it was 18 months to 2 years ago. So it's been a while. It was one of their spotlight series, looking at the overnight housekeeping workers and what they were up against. The rate of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, the mental stress of trying to keep themselves safe when they're in these big office buildings and there's nobody there. I normally work in Waltham, and before that I worked at Boston College, and after hours there's nobody there, and eventually the cleaning staff will show up, but there's no one to keep these mostly women safe. It's something that, again, it was here before COVID, and something that we will have to consider, I think, going forward. So the Women's Commission at the Commonwealth level was really proactive in trying to make sure they captured what was happening. So in mid-March, now if you'll remember, it feels like a lifetime ago, that COVID started to hit the week of March 9th. Now I remember that specifically because my son, his birthday was March 9th, and we decided to cancel everything. It was very strange. We'll move it a week. We'll move it 2 weeks. And by the end of that week, we had just canceled the birthday party altogether. We couldn't keep his great-grandmother safe. We didn't know what was happening. By mid-March, the state level commission had formed an action committee to try to figure out the impact of COVID on women. Now, again, this trauma of sexism, we're not focusing solely on COVID, but it's a lens through which we are examining these things. They held a virtual public hearing, and it was one of the earliest, truly, in the state of its kind, and they had a large number of participants, about 100 to 200, if I remember correctly. I should have put in my notes. Anyhow, they had a lot, and they talked about domestic violence. They had shared worries about losing their job, being able to make rent payments, being sick. All different participants shared their thoughts. This fed into a survey that was sent out. Maybe some of you participated. Over 2,500 residents in Massachusetts did, representing a fair number of all of our towns. The report is available, and there are links through these slides. It's an interesting report. I suggest that you take a look at it. It may inform your own work. So what they found was that, as I quoted before, the situation was exacerbating the stressors that are already there. Now, that may not seem so revolutionary, but it needed to be said out loud. It needed to be said at a state level in a document that matters to those who write our legislation, who make our policies. Women were being impacted in very particular ways in Massachusetts, and there was a devastating ripple effect, as they say. So, economic impact. At this point in our recent history, we weren't sure what was coming. Remember, this is early April when this data was gathered, and then the report came out in May. We know now, as it is early July, and there's concerns about people not making rent payments and mortgage payments, that there's economic impact. We know now more about the health issues. Massachusetts has done an excellent job of controlling the situation, but it had impact on health and will continue to do so. The concerns about the rise in domestic violence, and Tony will be addressing some of this in a little bit, and who constitutes an essential worker. What is the impact on incarcerated women? This is being slowly, in my opinion, addressed in other states, slowly, and it's reactionary. They address it after a bunch of incarcerated people get sick or pass away. Have we as a state really looked at the impact of incarcerated women? We weren't looking at it much beforehand, and how incarceration of women impacts their whole family generationally. And now we have this health crisis on top of it. So it wasn't that it caused the problem, it was already there, and we're just making things more complicated. The essential worker question, I'll just share something briefly that I don't have an answer to, but it may be interesting for you and may impact your work. In my research work for the think tank that I'm part of, in theory, we should be visiting colleges, universities, and K-12 schools in the fall and next spring. In theory, we don't know. And a coworker said to me, well, he was kind of playing it out. Essential workers, maybe they would get any vaccine first. In order for them to get it, perhaps their family members or household members would have to get it. And so those people would be like the first wave to receive the vaccination. Okay. My husband's an essential worker. He works out of the house every day. My friend said, well, then you're the one that would be eligible to travel. And we joked about that. But that's something that it's going to be interesting how this plays out. The stratification of who gets the vaccination when it becomes available. And what does that mean in terms of how the economy moves forward, how families move forward, how careers move forward? We don't know. And it's something that in your work as social workers, as educators, as researchers, I was just looking at the chat a few moments ago, everyone identifying themselves, which is great. Thank you for doing so. What will this mean for our work when we interact with the public? What will this mean for our neighborhoods and societies? It's something that we need to think about. And my friend Tony is going to give some more detail to these issues with some really great slides on the role of sexism and mental health and other issues. So I'm going to pass it over to Tony.
If you didn't already see, I posted links to Mary's article and to the statewide report. I am also posting a link to Tony's article in Medium as well. So if you want to, you can check all these articles out. Thank you. Sorry, Tony.
No problem. Thank you so much, Amy and Mary. I learned so much. I mean, I did read the study by the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, and there's just such a wealth of information there. So I encourage everybody to look at it when you get a chance. So we just talked about COVID-19 and the impact on women in general, but there are some issues that came up in COVID that already existed. So when I talk about sexism, we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about cisgendered women. So I understand that there are specific challenges when it comes to those that are transgender or part of the LGBTQIA++ community. But in this case, we're talking about cisgender women and looking at it from that standpoint. So we're talking about the impact of misogynism, which is basically the dislike and the disdain, almost contempt for women. Or we're talking about male chauvinism, which is thinking that women are inferior to men, or a patriarchal system where men are almost automatically seen as the power structure, whereas women are seen as subordinate or supports. We see that even in our country, where we tout the founding fathers, but don't really think of the women who also laid the foundation of this country as founding mothers, per se. So dealing with a system that has a patriarchal, chauvinistic, even misogynistic approach sometimes to women, and how that all mixes together to create a trauma in our lives. And one of the ways that we see that is through depression, where women are almost twice as likely as men to deal with depression. If you see the graph that's on the chart that's on the screen here, you see that women ages 40 to 59, 11% versus men in the same age group, that's 5.2%. Or look at women even 20 to 39 and over 60, we're seeing that it's so much higher. And when looking at that, my slide isn't changing. There we go. Looking at that, there is a strong relationship between the experiences of everyday sexism, some studies show, to depression and even PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that, as you look at it and you look at even the stress of the financial impact, when we're talking about COVID and we're even looking at the financial impact, you see that women are at such a higher percentage when it comes to the being at the federal poverty level. So women are more so impacted financially. So again, that goes into the percentage of women who make less and who have to deal with the stressors of life. We know that women are likely to make as little as 50% of what a man would make. So according to the National Center of PTSD, and dealing with all of the different stressors that when it comes to sexism, including financial stressors, that around 10% of women have PTSD compared to, at some point in their life, compared to only 4% of men. And that's a big gap when you think of veterans, because a lot of times we think of male veterans as having PTSD. We don't think of female veterans, and we don't think of the trauma that women endure. And we're going to talk a little bit about specific violence toward women. But I'm on the National Alliance on Mental Illness for Massachusetts, but the National Alliance in general says that the culture and gender roles are are also factors that contribute to the high prevalence of PTSD in women. So those culture and gender roles really put a sense of stress, a sense of fear, a sense of helplessness that women have to endure, that pass down and are distributed through different portions of our lives. And this PTSD is more evident in communities that stress traditional gender roles, because women in this type of culture feel more emotionally vulnerable. So again, this goes to whether we talk about religion, whether we talk about communities of color, whether we talk about certain immigrant communities, those that and where men have more social power, we see more PTSD in women. So, you know, just in case you didn't notice, I am a woman of color. So as a woman of color, I constantly think about in my life how racism and sexism kind of overlap, because as women, we deal with sexism and we deal with it most every day, whether we notice it or not, whether it affects us or not, whether it bothers us immediately or not, we deal with that. As a Black woman, I deal with, and other women of color deal with, racism almost every day, if not every day, whether we feel it or not, whether it immediately impacts us or not, and so on. So results of this study suggest that racism, sexism, and sexual objectification are all linked to women of color's symptoms of trauma. So women of color have to deal with not only the sexism that they experience and that we experience as women, but we also have to deal with racism on top of that. And then there's a certain sexual objectification that comes along with it because we're seen as exotic. We see that also when going back to slavery, going back to various issues where throughout our history, both national and globally, where women of color, again, are seen as exotic and more kind of enticing because of the color of our skin or because we look different. Now, trauma symptoms, sexism, and sexual objectification, like I said, were directly related to trauma symptoms, and discriminatory experiences also may result in trauma symptoms. So when we're looking at the trauma of sexism, it becomes, in women of color, it becomes very hard to extract which is which and which is going on in that moment. Am I experiencing traditional sexism, or am I experiencing racism, or is there a mix? Is it because I am both? Is it, you know, some people think because you're a woman and because you're a woman of color, you're a person of color, that, oh, you must have it great because you get to check 2 boxes. Well, that might be helpful sometimes getting us in the door of a situation. Where it's not helpful is when we actually have to take on leadership roles, when we have to actually work in certain situations, when we're looking to be influential voices or what have you. Those discrimination experiences are, you know, are doubled in a sense where we have to endure more. So what we experience is racism plus sexism equal trauma. It's not a percentage of racism plus a percentage of sexism when it comes with women of color. We have to experience the weight of it all. And sometimes that even plays out in our own race because of the sexism and some of the misogyny involved in the workplace. And when we're advocating for ourselves and our family, we have to fight stereotypes like the angry Black woman, which I get a lot. You know, I'm from Jersey, so being from New Jersey, when I first moved to Massachusetts, I'm a little louder than the Massachusetts kind of calming voice. And I would come in and I speak loud and I try to be confident and bold. And it's, why are you so angry? And it's like, I'm smiling, I'm not angry. But the thought that a Black woman, when she comes in, she's coming in as too dominant, too aggressive and angry, or that Latinas are loud and have poor boundaries, or that Asian women don't know how to stand up for themselves and they're submissive. So taking on that racist and xenophobic element combined with sexism is what leads us to dealing with some of the things that we deal with and causes us the level of trauma that leads to things like depression and PTSD. Now, why is that important? It's important because when we're thinking about COVID and when we're thinking about violence toward women, we're seeing an overlap in that right now because of the stressors that take place in the home, and a lot of what can spark, I should say, or trigger intimate partner violence situations is stress, stressors. So economic stress, the need to achieve, the feeling of powerlessness. So a lot of intimate partner violence is a control issue. And 1 in 4 women experience severe intimate partner violence of all various types. 1 in 3, some form of physical violence. 1 in 7 women have been injured. 1 in 10 women has been raped by their intimate partner. And the abuser's access to a firearm increases that risk of femicide, which is the homicide of women, by 400%. And 19% of intimate partner violence includes a weapon. So imagine dealing with these numbers and being trapped inside during a quarantine period or during self-isolation. You're talking about, again, increased trauma, increased stress. On top of that, the socioeconomic situations that's going on. As you saw with some of the things Dr. Mary talked about, you're being a frontline worker, having to deal with, in some instances where the woman is working, but as a frontline worker, but the male isn't. So there's that power dynamic in the relationship. So the trauma of sexism leads us and empowers when we talk about intimate partner violence. And like I said, it's all about power and control. What you see on the screen is what we call the Duluth model. And it's really good at talking about the power and control mechanism. But today, I really want to turn your attention to the portion that talks about, I was trying to draw it here. This portion here that talks about using male privilege. And that includes treating him or her like a servant. So treating in this case, her like a servant, making all the big decisions, or asking for input but not valuing that input, acting like the master of the castle. This is my house. Treating the woman like there are certain defined roles. You're supposed to do this because you're the woman. But then there's an added impact when you talk about now, when you talk about the economic abuse aspect of it, where we have systems in place, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that feed into emotional trauma just with outside of a personal relationship. But inside of this violent and abusive relationship, you have preventing the person from getting or keeping the job, or forcing the person to work, which we're seeing in COVID, saying you have to go to work even though your health might be in jeopardy and you might have pre-existing conditions. Making that person and making that woman ask for money even though she might be the one helping make the money, or preventing her from work where she has to rely on him for the money. Not necessarily letting her know about all the family income, using status, even using the courts and the court systems and government and educational systems to control the woman. Why? Because those systems are in place. And again, there are patriarchal, misogynistic, chauvinistic system that is in place. So it actually empowers the offender. Similar to racism, when sexism abounds throughout the justice, health, employment, financial, and other systems that's in place, the offender, the abuser, is empowered because he can use those systems to further exhibit power and control over his victim. So when we talk again about the trauma of sexism, we can't extrapolate intimate partner violence or COVID or education. We can't say those are separate things because this goes to all of the trauma that women endure. How do I get rid of it? Sorry about this, everyone. There we go. So trauma, again, going back to intimate partner violence, it leads to feelings of fear, feelings of feeling out of control, lack of focus, trouble concentrating, guilt, and also grief about the relationship, because our culture is really bent on women. Part of their success is having a successful marriage and family. There's a sense of failure and guilt when in a intimate partner relationship, and when that falls apart or when she feels as though she has to leave. So there's becomes trust issues. It goes into physical issues and injuries, the injuries related to the abuse, and also sometimes self-injury. Health issues such as high blood pressure or triggering things like lupus or other autoimmune diseases that can be triggered by stress. Fluctuations in weight, becoming overly aggressive or becoming overly timid due to a response to the trauma. And then we can't forget our young women, our children, but even young girls that are involved in, I don't like to say exposed to or witnesses of, because children who are present on the scene during a domestic violence situation or live in the home have their own domestic violence experiences. And in some cases, we even consider that child abuse to be exposed to that type of violence and abuse. So we're talking about situations where the trauma is even passed on to the children in those situations. So one thing, as we look at all of the trauma when it comes to COVID, when it comes to systemic issues, when it comes to where women work and how much they make and where they work at, we see that there are inequities in all of the systems when it comes to sexism. We can talk about the criminal justice system and how women are treated and how it's difficult for women to get their children back, and what it looks like when a woman is pregnant within the justice system, and the role of healthcare and mental health care within the justice system, even when it comes to young women. We can look at the economic system. One thing we find that women are less likely to get loans and grants, which we're seeing even with COVID and small businesses. Women are less likely to get loans and grants, and credit card limits are less, and interest rates are higher, and insurance is higher, and all of these different things that make life more expensive. So not only are we making less as women, but life is more expensive as women. And then if you add on that we're women of color, then you're talking about all of these things are exacerbated even more. Then we talk about access to health care and mental health care, how women have less access and sometimes, again, even higher rates to pay. Then the educational system, we still have issues where we're not pushing women and young girls towards STEM education, but more frontline types of jobs and not really getting the level of education sometimes that is suggested. In many parts of the world and many parts of the country, it isn't even suggested to some young girls that they go to college. Then once you're in the educational system as a student, a lot of girls don't get the same support that their male counterparts get. And a lot of women who work in the educational system don't get the level of respect and the level of opportunities for advancement and research that male counterparts get. So again, add race to that, and then you end up with what feels like sometimes an impossible dynamic. We go into religion that some religions really place a very hierarchical aspect to it that causes trauma. Women who think they shouldn't leave a relationship because of submissiveness to a violent relationship due to submissiveness of the male, or women who don't want to earn more than the male because of the male's role as breadwinners in the home and the such. And then government laws, we still are fighting for the Violence Against Women Act to constantly be renewed. We're still fighting for civil liberties and various healthcare and abortion laws and different things like that. So when we look at all of these systems together, it really, number one, shows us how amazing we are as women to be able to champion and fight against all of these different systems and succeed in the way that we do. But it also brings out the issues that are involved with COVID, because these are the things that existed before COVID. And now COVID is showing us that our health is being impacted because of the systemic issues that exist. Then again, I always have to say it, add racism to that and other forms of discrimination to that. And this is what we as women have to deal with. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Mary, but hopefully this gives you some kind of some overview of some of the things that we need to fight for, some of the things we need to advocate about and be activists about, and really challenge the powers that be, that so that we can become the powers that be. And I have to say this, make sure you vote. That's one very important thing. Dr. Mary?
Thank you. That was very, very powerful. And there are so many, I'm going to, for a little team thing here, Tony, I'm going to let you still share the screen. Does that work? Because you were clever and got the closed captioning. Thank you. I didn't think about that, and I appreciate it. And it's so important to include that. But yes, that we need to see ourselves as equal voices and to pay attention. And I know we all do. Everyone here is someone who's already thinking about these things. So, and that's good. Are we in a position to encourage others to think this way? Amy and I were talking before everyone joined us, and how sometimes I walk a narrow path in trying to explain to folks and be the neck that turns the head. And some folks I'm just not going to be able to convince. But I've got the numbers. I've got the facts like Tony has shared. And I hope that you'll find this information empowering and you'll be able to use it in your own work. So we've got some ideas here, some call to action items. There's a lot more that we could include. And so I hope that in our last section here, when we talk as a group, that you'll share some ideas you have for calls to action. One thing I was thinking about, Tony, as I was listening to you, if you go to your town meeting or city council meeting, depending on where you are, and you're looking at who's in charge, how many of them are women? How many of them are people of color? How many of them are young? How many of them are new? Is there renewal? Like these are the things that even if you are not someone who wants to be actively involved in politics, let's say, whether it's a committee in your workplace, committee in your institution, we have to keep track of these things. And so that's something small, but it's going to have a big impact. Did you want to share something, Tony?
Yeah, and you know, we kind of look at diversity as a forced action, right? Like we need to do this so it can look like we're diverse. And I think right now our communities, our political climate, our cultural climates are so focused on looking diverse that we forget inclusion and belonging. So that's why it's so important that we do look at our local people that we're politicians all the way up to our national, because that is what gives us that sense of belonging. That not only is someone put in office that looks like us, but someone that shares our beliefs, that share our culture, that share our point of view. So while, you know, like you said, while we might not be able to or want to be actively involved in politics and run for office ourselves, even though we do need more women and women of color to run and be in the room and be at the table, if that's not you, then at least at the least, which is not a small thing, try to put people in the room that look like you, that see life through a similar lens as you look, because that is a way to have our voices heard, and that is a way to deal with some of the systemic issues, whether it be racism or sexism. It's not just, you know, we have to do it in a way that we have to say it's not just when we voted in one woman or one person of color, because that's not empowering them. That they have to get in that position and then fight against all the other males or white males at the table. So really making sure that we have true diversity so that all voices are heard.
Exactly, because then we'll have people who have perhaps lived some of this information that we've shared, or know others who can actually write legislation or advocate in meaningful ways, or ways that haven't been done yet in our communities. I know there are many folks who want to be good citizens and try to bring forward ideas, but we need lots of different kinds of people. So that was something that came to mind, Tony, so thanks for going off script with me for a little bit, but it's really important. So some ideas for calls to action. I'm going to do the first couple, and then Tony, I'll hand it over to you. So I'm hoping, and if we have, I believe we've got Sasha and a few others from MCSW, the survey and the work that went into it, the action committee, all that stuff was so important, but the world has changed a few times since then. And while I know it was expensive both in time and treasure for that study to be and report to be developed, I think we got to do it again. I think we've got to get a sense of what's happening at this point in the COVID experience, in the social upheaval experience, and I would ask, if all possible, let's do another one. Let's find out what's happened since April, because it feels like the world has changed dramatically since then. So that's the first thing that I would suggest. Secondly, and we touched on this a little bit, that if we can volunteer our time, treasure, our talent to nonprofits, many of whom are represented here by incredible professionals, whose missions are to address disparities caused by race, gender, economics. Like, let's actively participate if we can. Amy has put in, I was following the chat a little bit, Amy has put in some organizations in the Worcester area that are trying to help with domestic violence, and they have been for a long time, but now they're really looking at it in this unusual space of, well, now we're in phase 3, but up until now we were pretty closed in. And so if we can participate, and if we can't be there physically, let's share our treasure or talent if we can. Easier said than done, but it's something that I would call on all of us to consider. As a very much a white person, it is something that I need to position myself and to think about that. I have interesting conversations with colleagues and acquaintances who are not aware that many of my nieces and nephews do not look like me. And I hear a lot of interesting conversations because they don't expect me to have relatives who are Black or brown. And it's just awful. And so I'm in a position to try to actively advocate for the people I love and my neighbors who I love who deserve better. And so with the privilege I have as a white woman, I'm going to try to do what I can. I hope you'll join me.
If I can talk, if we can talk about, because we have a little extra time. So if we can talk about that for a second, because I think that's a call to action that we probably should have included. And that is what the individual woman can do in everyday life. And it's just speaking out, you know. There was something on Facebook that was on my timeline where, you know, there's 4 Black mayors, 3 or 4 Black mayors that are, you know, are prominent right now, and you see them a lot. And I noticed that a lot of the comments weren't about their intelligence. It wasn't about the work that they were doing. A lot of the comments were how they looked and how pretty they were and how sexy they were and all of these other things. So I immediately, even though that's great, you know, that women in power are seen that way, because at one time we weren't, you know, as seen as feminine, but we kind of had switched, and the conversation was more about the sexism of it than that these women were powerful women. So I spoke out against that. So in your case and in mine, I think it really gives us an opportunity as women to have those difficult conversations with either our female counterparts or people of our same or opposite race or a different race or ethnicity, just to say, you know, that's not right. You know, kind of going back to how we were when we were little kids and we just found out that something was wrong. And then all of a sudden you're just running around telling everybody, you can't do that, you can't do that. So, you know, I'm not pushing it as far as really cancel culture, but we do need to push it as far as being proactive educators instead of reactive in our approaches. So I just want to add that as a call to action to kind of, even if you can't volunteer with an organization, you can volunteer your time by, you know, speaking out in a respectful and professional way to those that you see doing something wrong.
Absolutely. And I have encountered folks who feel rather entrenched and cornered politically and culturally and emotionally right now. Maybe you have too.
A lot more than I even expected.
Isn't that, it's happening a lot across all kinds of spectrums.
And it's covered, you know, you talk about trauma. It also affects your trust, because I found that people of all races that I had in my circle that I thought were trustworthy and really well-grounded people, in the last, you know, 3 or 4 months, you know, it's gotten to the point where I no longer want to associate or even speak with them, you know. So it does even cause that trauma of loss, that trauma of, well, I can't really trust anybody. What is this person's ulterior motive? You know, these things, what we're going through right now, we really have to kind of understand and I'm curious about the long-term impact of even our conversations on our relationships with one another.
Yes, that would be really interesting. So jot that down, Amy. Another Trauma Tuesday could be just that. Isn't it striking? Yes. And with those people who feel cornered and entrenched, in my own experience, you know, because we all live in our bubbles. I mean, we're in a bubble right now because of COVID, but we all lived in our bubbles beforehand, either ethnically or politically or geographically. We had our bubbles, whether we're aware of it or not. I find it more effective to have conversations, to read all I can from the other side of an issue, so I'm prepared when that person who I talk to on a regular basis, it's just nonsensical to me, but I know where that person's getting his or her information, right? And so we have a real conversation. I have been able to make some progress there. And maybe for our friends who are joining us today, social media can make things worse or maybe share idea. It can go either way. And so knowing how to have those phone conversations or Zoom conversations with somebody who thinks completely differently is very, very difficult. But as a white person, it is something that I need to continue to learn how to do and continue to learn how to do well so that I can really start to change some minds, because those people are going to go vote. These people I know very well who I completely disagree with are going to go vote in a few months. And I want to give them all the information I can in a way that I can persuade rather than make them feel more entrenched.
Right.
And that is difficult, but it is something that I'm Hungarian Irish, so I call myself the Magyar Mick. As the Magyar Mick, I'm trying to do well, and it's not always easy, but it's something that we do need to think about, those of us who are in this position. I think that transitions well, Tony, into your line here about voting.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about it, but I think we miss how powerful our vote is. And we talk about marginalized communities, we talk about women, but one of the things that we also have to think about is how our political power can be thwarted by sexism. I was just talking to someone earlier this week who talked about the how even like domestic violence can become politicized, where if there's a difference in views, sometimes the male won't allow the female to go vote or to talk about politics or express their political views. And how when there's a lack of child care when you need to go vote, and it's like, okay, can't bring the children in, or they're too small, or COVID, you don't want them exposed, and why mail-in ballots are so important to women during this time. So when I say speak up and speak out with your vote during elections, I do want to add that that additional component of speak up and speak out about how voting is handled for elections and access to that. It is helpful when voting is at the school, but what about children that are in school age? And what can we do to make voting more accessible for women, women of color, women who might not have, due to financial reasons, might not have the proper identification and different lower education. Women are coming that have been justice system involved. There's so much that goes into our election process that we have to think about above and beyond just clicking the ballot, so to speak. And I do want to shift a little bit because we're talking about some really powerful things, and I like to always bring it back, and that's what the next point is, to some very, very basic things. And we talk about the trauma of frontline workers, especially women as frontline workers. Well, one thing we can do to minimize that trauma is be courteous and patient. Understand that they are dealing with potentially the worst time in their life. They're dealing with fear of getting sick, fear of making their family sick when they go home to their family. We're caregivers. Some of us are dealing with mentally ill or physically disabled or differently abled or developmental disabilities, autism spectrum, dealing with children that have challenges, dealing with husbands or significant others that have challenges. And in the middle of all of this, we go to work. And then at work, you're upset because we're a little distracted as frontline workers. So be a little more courteous, be a little more patient. When you're dealing with some of the frontline workers, say thank you. Just, I appreciate your time. It's not that they have to come to work because they have to do their job. They have to come to work because they want to take care of their families. The same reason why your job closed, because they allowed you to take care of your family. What you're actually seeing is the country is being run by the very same individuals that don't usually get access to the systems that are in place.
Exactly.
Women.
Wait.
Yeah,
Say that again.
ahead.
Say that again. Say that again. Because nobody says that except for you and me.
The country is being run by the very people that, whatever I said,
access to the systems that are in place. Thank you.
Access to the systems that are in place. We are running the country. Women,
Right.
low-income individuals, immigrant individuals, whether it be forced or what's the other word? Forced or voluntary migration, because we have to
Right.
think about that too. You know, these are communities that are making this country run right now, and the very communities that have to still get out there and march, talk about anti-sexism, anti-racism, and everything else. So really being courteous and patient with those individuals, maybe giving an extra tip or saying something nice other than, hey, thank you for bringing me my food. You know, how are you today? Showing real, genuine care for their humanity. And all of this starts with us as individuals. You know, it's always good to get mad at the system, but the system is really just a piece of paper. It's all written down. We are what makes the system work or not work. The people in the system. So when people come to me and say, oh, the system is bad, it's not really about the system. It's about the people who operate the system and work in the system. So it's up to you to vow to live in an anti-sexism, anti-racism, diverse and inclusive life, influencing others to do the same. In other words, you, by changing yourself, you are changing the system. Understand as women that we are powerful beings, that we are empowered, that we are the mothers of the country, of the world, of the human race. That if we were not, and I say this the same that I say about Black people especially, if we weren't so powerful as Black people and as women in general, if we weren't so powerful, our power would not be diminished, oppressed, and suppressed in such a deliberate manner. So use that to really empower yourself to really strike out and fight against these things and speak up.
Beautifully said. Absolutely correct. And I hope that last bit stays with us all. That's a really important bit, Toni. I think if you're comfortable, perhaps we can start to have a conversation. Toni, what do you think? Are we ready for that?
Yeah. I don't know. I know Jonathan Hardy just put a very interesting comment. He said, I just have to say, and I hope I'm using the right pronoun. I just have to say that if you're a man in a field that's female dominated, you have a responsibility to speak out about the inequities that your female colleagues experience, just like white people need to confront racism. Men need to speak out against sexism. Use your voice to elevate others. And thank you for confirming your pronoun. But yes, it's a responsibility of all of us to speak out. It's not a problem, just like racism is not the problem just for Black people to solve. Sexism is not the problem just for women to solve. Right. We all are invested in this because the success of any organization and the success of the country depends on collaboration and unity. So if we're not getting that equity in there and that sense of belonging, then yeah, we're going to fail. So I completely agree with you. Thank you, Jonathan.
I do too. And if I can add a quick thought about that, Jonathan, I would love to connect afterward. My husband was military. There were very few women he was an officer in the Air Force. And it's just his nature and partly the way he was raised. Of the 2 or 3 women in the whole unit, we would talk about it. He's like, I don't want to be their brother because they had the same training as me. I'm not going to protect them. But sometimes somebody has to stand beside them and say stuff. And I said, exactly, you're standing beside. You're not standing in front. You're not pushing her forward to say the thing that you don't want to say. You're standing beside because you're aligned with them. And I think that's also kind of what you're saying, Jonathan, that there's a role of men, especially in the opposite words, there are very few women. That was the opposite example, of course, but to stand beside them and to advocate in ways that perhaps they need someone else to join them in saying. So I totally agree.
Well, we see that a lot in the nonprofit world, right? Where it's a lot of female in the nonprofit world. And, I stress diversity in that world too. Like, hey, I don't mind telling boy, hey, you got to get some men in here, you got to get some people of color. And I think it also creates a dynamic where there's some infighting with women because, we had to fight to get into this role. So we have to try to fight to keep and sometimes it does take a voice of somebody that's not directly involved to show that, there is commonality there. And, the ally voice, as it were, is a really strong voice because sometimes people don't listen to the person affected. Sometimes they listen to the person that has stepped out and has a specific lens. One of the reasons why the civil rights movement worked as well as it did, it wasn't because, the Black voice couldn't be heard. We were heard, but we had allies in various other communities that were in power before the, Black people and women were in a position to step up to power. Those allies had a strong voice, so it's really important.
They were using their privilege and their position to signal boost what was being said, and we still need to do that for each other. Absolutely. Right. Other thoughts, questions, or things that occurred to anyone while we shared a lot of information. So thank you all for your attentiveness.
Amazing, you guys. Wow. I guess I just one thought I had too was inequality hurts all of us. Any kind of inequality hurts the people that are the victims of it much more than the people that are the perpetrators of it, but it hurts everybody. I was looking for that quote. It's Tony Porter, and it's something to the effect of, if it would destroy a 12-year-old boy to be called a girl, what are we teaching boys about girls? Right? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite soapboxes is that we have decided, mental health is my jam, and we've decided that having emotions is female and feminine somehow, right? And so men are restricted from having a full range of emotions, from showing a full range of emotions, and they're dying by suicide in much greater numbers. This is not serving them to look at women as less than in any way, shape, or form. And I'm just so grateful that you highlighted that in so many ways, that you're intersectional in your approach, that we're not just talking about white women. It's different for women of color. It's different for lesbians. It's different for immigrants. All of these things layer, and it's really just so important for us to try to understand people's experiences. And the piece you said about giving them the space, giving them the support, really important and powerful points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy, I think you made a great comment there about, the sensitive nature of having emotions as a woman. It's to the point that, if we see a woman cry, she's weak. And if we see a woman in business that might be a little frazzled or, want to take time off for family, she's weak. It really, the message almost that we're sending, not only our male children, but our female children, regardless, and I'm going by gender identity, with the message that we're sending our children is that you can't have emotion. that in order to be a strong man, you can't have emotion. In order to be a woman in a man's world, you can't have emotion. And that we're supposed to be robots, but in the same breath, we're telling people we're all human and act like humans. And we're also sending a message to the younger generation not to trust the opposite sex because they're so flawed. So we're saying that women, because we're traumatized by men, don't trust men. And men, because women are angry or bitter or have been traumatized or weak, don't trust women. You need to lead them and protect them. We have to figure out a balance there.
And we're perpetuating the things that we know are not good for us as people or our society. I think Ms. Stevens is raising a really important point that has sickened a lot of us who are in military affiliated communities. Naomi, do you want to speak to it, or shall I open to that? I want to give her a chance to unmute if she'd like, and if not, I'll be happy to speak to it.
Okay, I guess you can go ahead.
So in the chat box, you'll see that Naomi is speaking about Vanessa Gillen, whose remains were recently found outside Fort Hood. And as I understand it, and the investigation's ongoing, she explained to her superior officers, as I understand, multiple times that she was being sexually harassed and intimidated. Her family knew something was wrong. She had folks who are trying to advocate for her when she went missing, because she went missing in a very strange way. She didn't have her things with her. And she's a soldier, and she had training in self-defense and combat. And so it didn't add up. Well, it didn't add up because of the systemic sexism and harassment and trauma and criminality that apparently was happening within her unit or across Fort Hood. And it remains to be seen, as far as I'm aware, how far this went. But if no one acted, then that's systemic. And that's criminal all the way up. And it's infuriating because it's one of those things where it could have been, I would think, stopped. It could have been stopped. And
yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, when we talk about that overlap of the systemic issue, it goes back to looking like you're doing it right versus actually doing it right. You know, people thought the problem was solved when they allowed women in the military and then allowed women to move up the ranks and allowed women to fight with men. But the systems were still in place that did not see women as equal. And still, it was no longer, you're not a soldier, you're a female soldier. And hey, because, and then this is the power and control, because we know sexual assault is about power and control. So it's about, wait, you're not equal with us. We need to break you down. And we need to show you how feminine you are. And then the system is saying, yeah, you know, she just can't take it. You know, she just can't understand it. I mean, I even look back and I'm, you know, I'll sprinkle it in. I don't want to trigger anybody, but I look at my own story and my first sexual assault when we went to court. I was only 12 years old. When we finally went to court with it, the two young men, for lack of a better word, that assaulted me, the judge told them if they don't rape anybody again, then it will be expunged from their record when they're 18. So they got no time, they got nothing. And it wasn't even if you don't commit a crime. It was if you don't rape anybody. So when you talk about the systemic issue, it's not enough that, oh, we're going to bring awareness and get women to speak out. It's what are you going to do about it? And again, going back to the racial element, that is also what we're saying in the racial/sexism space of, okay, we acknowledge that there's a problem, but what are we going to do about it systemically? And the answer is justice, right? The answer is hold to the laws and keep the laws are there. You know, we're not at a stage now like we did before the voting, the Violence Against Women Act. We
Right.
have these laws in place. The problem is systemically, we're not enforcing them or using them proactively as what would have been the case with Vanessa Gullin.
Tony, thank you for sharing. That was, I imagine it's very difficult, and I appreciate you sharing in such a meaningful way. And what you're describing with Vanessa, I think fits very well from what I understand of the case. And Naomi, I'm glad you brought it up because it is infuriating. And if we don't recognize things as systemic, we're not going to address them. It's not going to get any better. We're just going to perpetuate a system that we won't even acknowledge is there. And that's very problematic. Yes, I was going to ask you to share the slide, Tony. Thank you. This is a very important slide. And I was so glad that Tony included it. And, you know, read through it, sit with it for a minute, and we'll sort of summarize for you. But think about this in terms of the phased reopening, right? Depending on where you are in the country. Now, remember, I'm military affiliated. I've got friends all over this country. And it varies from place to place. But we're opening up nail salons and bars and restaurants, and who's working in these places?
Women.
In terms of also the largest share of women of color, in terms of the underpaid aspect of the work, as we see here on the left-hand side, 52 cents on the dollar. We're going to open things up in such a way that we have to see the system that is there and how it is damaging our communities, because we're only as healthy as our weakest, right? And if you're making it very, very difficult for women to raise families and take care of the community, you're going to make the whole community suffer, whether you're acknowledging it or not. And so this is a really important slide, really, really important stuff to be included. Other thoughts from Tony or for anyone else?
Hopefully we get some more questions, but I do want to bring this out a little, because when you're talking about, you know, women in general as frontline workers, but this is women of color, so it's not just Black women, it's women from basically non-white, non-Hispanic women who are our frontline workers. And you know, when we talk about 61.2% of manicurists and pedicurists, you know, there were so many women who were like, well, I need my nails done, I need my feet done, which I believe in a lot of countries that wouldn't be really listed as a need. Right. But here, evidently it is, but we're not really thinking about that 61.2% of those women are women of color. That when you want to go into a hotel, that 60% of your maids and housekeepers, your skincare, you know, all of the things that make your life comfortable is predominantly, as you see, anywhere from 44 to 60% women of color, and we see that it's up to 70% by your slides you showed earlier, Dr. Mary, like, of women in general. So when you talk about that combined with low income, less access to healthcare, less savings, that means they can't take time off work because they don't have that savings there. And then we didn't even get to talk about single parent homes and how all of this, because you have single parents that have, you know, more than the trifecta. It's, I can't even bring in, as a single parent, especially of young children. My children, thank God, are older now. But even as when your children are young, during this quarantine, you can't bring in grandparents and other people to help support trying to homeschool, and you're going to work, and you can't get a healthcare person, a childcare person to come in because you're scared of contaminating your home. But you're a frontline worker, and you're dealing with sexism, and you're dealing with racism and everything else overlapping. No wonder we're seeing an increase in death by suicide and trauma and depression and all of these other things that are going on, and even health issues. And on top of it, what we are seeing too is with COVID, once people get COVID also impacts the psychological component. So on top of all of this, if these women get COVID, there is increased depression and psychosis that sometimes come with COVID. So, I mean, we really have to really pay attention to these issues more so.
Yes, I'd like to say one quick thing, and then I'd like to, Naomi's got another important point. One way that all of us can really make a big difference is to make sure that we and our neighbors and our constituents and our clients are completing the census, have participated in the census, and that we pay attention to the census. Because if we are not making sure that everyone is counted, it's going to have devastating effects on what we understand about our society, as well as funding and support. So if you look in the fine print here, this is coming from the American Community Survey. It is not linked, even in the federal government stuff, it is not linked in the Bureau of Labor Statistics Women's Bureau, which is, that's a whole nother discussion, isn't it? But and if it is there, it's a heck of a lot more hard to find it. And so I'd have to dig longer than I already did. And I shouldn't have to. It should all be right there. But that's just as Tracy Novick says, a budget is a values choice, as some of us in Worcester who follow her, this is a values choice. By not connecting these things more explicitly, by not talking about these, we're showing our values. You know, you can disagree with them, but that's what we're saying as a country, that we're not going to acknowledge that 61% of the people who are going to do your nails, who are right up close to you, physically touching you, are women of color and getting underpaid. Naomi Stevens raised a very interesting point about waitresses and waiters still making below minimum wages, hoping to make enough in tips. A lot of people are single parents. I mentioned before I worked in restaurants through college. I, again, was in a privileged position because I wasn't supporting anybody at that time, and I could live in my parents' home during breaks from college, or if I was picking up shifts. There was an interesting point in New York where they tried an experiment of not having tips, and of course that meant that everything got more expensive on the menu and people didn't want to pay it. So I think it's an example of charity versus allyship, that if you are going to say, well, it's not right. I'm not saying that you're saying this at all, Naomi. I'm sure you're not. But I've encountered folks like, well, they should get paid more. Okay, then you've got to pay. Then your meal just got more. Where's this going to magically come from? And again, you're not saying this, Naomi. I know you're not. But it's something that these difficult conversations that we're in a position as advocates to perhaps help. What more would you like to say about it? We'd love to hear your voice, Naomi. And then Tony.
Is Naomi speaking? I wanted to give her space. One of the things I think too comes from the fact that most of the wait staff is minority, female, or immigrant. We look at them like we're doing them a favor by giving them a tip. I mean, when we go to the doctor, he's providing a service, right? We don't say, well, I'm going to adjust your bill based on how I feel I was treated. We don't do that in any other capacity. When we even get our nails done, we pay a higher price point and then give an additional tip. And we are okay with that. But for some reason, we almost see waiters, and I should say the wait staff, almost as our limited slaves for that time. And that's something as a Black person I can say. We almost see them as that, you bring me my food, I'm being serviced by you, and if you do a good job, here's a couple of pennies to help you out. Mm-hmm. Some even make jokes that, I was at one event, leave a little food on your plate, they eat it in the back. No, they don't. They're not eating your leftover food. But that goes from that same thought that during times of slavery, they would leave food on their plate so that the slaves could taste a little bit of the food because they weren't supposed to eat the same food. So, I think it's also going back to that, we're doing you a favor, here's a few pennies so that I can feel superior because I'm sitting at the table and you're bringing me food. And I think as a capitalist American culture, it's hard for us to break away from that.
Ms. Stevens, I'm so glad you're unmuted. Why don't you jump right in?
Absolutely. This is such an important question. I'm Loretta Stevens. I went on my daughter's link to this Zoom.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'm also a pastor, so a lot of this information is essential for me to know. Not only to know, but I've experienced, I'm sure, at least 80% of what we talked about today. Yeah, I'm concerned. My initial question or concern was in the military. Why did I have to discourage my goddaughter not to go into the military? Because of this is a couple years ago. The same thing happened a couple years ago when a young women in general were being assaulted in the military. I had to bring up statistics to prove to her, because of her small stature, she's very small. And I said, I just would not rest knowing that you're there. And it shouldn't be that way. It's an equal place for us to now, thank God, they've opened up the door for women to be in military, and also to have, not supervisory, but military positions. But why would we be afraid to go? And also, and my second question was in reference to waitress, which you so eloquently put it. However, it is I think it's very unfair that these women, I've never been a waitress, but these women and men are getting below minimum wage. They have families. Some of these people are basically sleeping in homeless hotels and trying to take care of their children because they're not making enough money. It's not fair that we as women, even those that are in supervisory management positions, are still making 52% on the dollar or less than what our male counterparts are making. I don't know, just like any other, just like in the racism, what's going systemic racism, voices are only heard as long as you are talking. You always, and it's unfortunate that there has to be a tragedy before eyes are open. What is more unfortunate is the fact that once the season has passed, the person is buried, okay, or the topic is no longer discussed, it goes back to systemic. And I'm working on it, and I'm trying to see what we can do to forward. This conversation is just so important, and I thank you so much. I really would like to have the recording, because even in our women's group or whatever, I would love to have this, they could see it and talk about it, because it needs to be discussed. We as women has been quiet too long. We as Black Americans have been quiet. Black, brown Americans have been quiet too long. So we need to speak out. Now is a great time to get these issues on the table, that we could get some relief, because it hurts when you're working in the same position as a male. She said time is running out. Okay, you can't give a preacher a mic.
Oh, you're doing just fine. Oh, Reverend Stevens, you're doing beautifully. I think I'm going to say one quick thing, and then I'm sure Tony has some thoughts. But Reverend Stevens, I value your thoughts. Thank you, and I hope you'll keep talking. So I come from an immigrant, blue-collar, working-class background. Not so much me, but my parents and grandparents. And I was raised in that mindset. And my grandma would say, it's so expensive to be poor. People don't understand how expensive it is to be a single mother and to be poor. Absolutely. And that stayed with me. I've always, and I bring up in these conversations I have at places like Boston College, and they look at me like I have two heads because they haven't lived it. And I'm only tangential, but I respect it, because it is so hard to make ends meet, and you have to work twice, maybe 3 times as hard. before you can kind of make ends meet, and it's ridiculous sometimes. I think what you are describing is right on. And Tony, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've been a single mother for most of my kids' life, and the challenges of being a single mother, trying to have a career, trying to have an education, trying to really find a place in the world is really, really difficult, because even when you go for a job and they find out that you're a single parent, it's, well, will you be taking days off? Will you, do you have good childcare? Stuff that you're not supposed to ask, but stuff that becomes part of the question. Even if it becomes part of the question once you get in, that prohibits you from advancing. So one thing, Jonathan had made a really good comment that goes to what Pastor Stevens was saying as well. And what I commented was, paying less means less power. And it's a way of controlling us and a way of keeping us in our quote unquote place, right? So if women made as much as men, what would happen? It's really a fear of losing the power dynamic. White males are actually the minority. White individuals are actually the minority in comparison to all non-white individuals grouped together. So you really have the minority trying to retain control from when the country first started.
Right.
And a lot of these things are passed down. So yes, for the single mother, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I, have lived in Camden, New Jersey, and in some really difficult situations as a single mother. I've been homeless twice in my life as a single mother with my kids. I had to, all of my education, and I'm here to tell you that 52 cents on the dollar, as little as 52 cents on the dollar, that would have been a good day on a lot of occasions. When you're working, especially when you're working in a corporate arena or a firm or higher education or something like that, when your insurance rate is higher because you're paying for a whole family, but you're only 2 or 3 people, when you have to pay higher copays, when your life insurance through your job is different. So you get penalized in other ways that isn't necessarily taken into consideration when the system was created. Or maybe it was, which would
Or
be
maybe it was.
Yeah.
Or maybe my grandmother would say it absolutely was, because she was in many times your position. So I am here to tell you, Tony, that your sons and future descendants will be stronger because of everything you went through, because I know that to be true in my own lived experience. Just a few generations ago, there was no education and it was bad. And here we are.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I believe that's the case. My son is already doing better. My older son especially, he's a business owner. He's had his business for 3 years. He's doing great. But my mother is an entrepreneur and has, I was the first one to graduate college, but she was the first one to go to college. She was the first one in our family, our particular family line, to graduate high school. My grandfather didn't even have a high school education. So, it does trickle down from generation to generation, and each generation is empowered. But with that said, it's still taking too long because we're fighting against systemic changes where there should be a much bigger change between generations when it comes to equity, whether it be gender equity or race equity.
I took my oldest child to women's marches in Boston and the following year in Hartford, and there was, can't remember which one it was, but it must have been Boston. A person who looked older, white hair, big sign. The sign said, "I can't believe I still have to protest this. My coworkers are 4, so I'm not going to say the word, but you get the idea. That And my daughter, who's older and upstairs reading, she's, what is that about? I said, because our grandmothers did the same fight and we're still doing it. She's, oh, well, that's depressing. I said, that just means that you have to work harder, girl. This is going to be your mantle to pick up in a little while, so you've got to fight. So other questions, other thoughts? Is this impacting, and Amy, you cut us off if we are, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I think we're good. Okay.
You're so good.
Other thoughts
I
in
just
terms
wanted
of how
to
this,
say
please, yeah.
that, you know, this is trauma, right? Like the biggest part of trauma is that it keeps us feeling isolated. It compounds itself. Usually, like one trauma, like it never just happens you have one, right? One is just the starting point. So you're experiencing sexism, you're experiencing racism, then you're experiencing poverty, and then your kids have bad schools. And so like it just snowballs. And that's the reason we're doing this series, and that it really does give me hope that, you know, at least 30 to 50 people show up each time because they just care enough about other people's experience. And that is like, I hang my hat on that. Like, it is so meaningful and important to me, because empathy is really like the only answer. If we don't take the time to understand what's happening to people we care about, we're never going to be able to stop it if we can't even look at it. So it's so powerful to be talking about the things that people just don't want to talk about because it's uncomfortable. And we cannot let comfort keep us where we are.
Right. Don't let that hold us back from doing the right thing. I'm just going to have one quick thought that occurred to me as I'm listening to you. Those of us who work in education, either as teachers or researchers or what have you, typically, and I had a very good training to be a teacher, and many teachers in my family, none of us had training on trauma. None of us. And if anything, we're so, well, that's the social worker's job. Many schools don't have a social worker, or that's the counselor's job. Many schools don't have counselors, let alone nurses. And yet we're encountering trauma. Just now I'm starting to see that to be more of a common discussion about social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, but we don't know what the heck we're talking about because we were not trained in trauma ourselves. And we also have to acknowledge the fact that most of us are white middle-class women. Most teachers in this country are. And are we not perpetuating this system by what we're teaching, how we're describing it, the questions? We have to see that all of this is political, and we could be re-traumatizing or emphasizing something that is not right. When I taught in Texas, the books they wanted us to use were kind of whitewashed, frankly. And it was bizarre. I refused to use them, so I used an older one that was better, I thought. The children I taught thought that Lady Bird Johnson was the nicest lady. How is she doing? I said, well, darling, she died many, many years ago. Mrs. Burns isn't like the textbook. So we're using, because that one talked about Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Almost all my students were Mexican or Mexican American. They weren't in the book. And unless you use an old one, right? So everything we do is a political choice and a choice of our values. And so we have, I can only speak to the educator's perspective, that we need to think about this. And you think about power and control and status. I'm off my soapbox.
And that's what I want to bring to the conversation. You know, we look at this power and control wheel, and we look at it for domestic violence. But when we talk about sexism and racism, think about this in terms of our relationship with the country. Women's relationship with the country. Do we have coercion and threats that from various systems threatening to leave us, threatening to report us, threatening to make us do illegal things in order to survive? Is there forms of intimidation? Is there emotional abuse inherent in the systems that we live and work in? Do we feel isolated? Are we minimized, or when we complain, are our complaints minimized? Or are we blamed for our own problems that we're complaining about? You know, are our children used against us to hold us hostage or to suppress our voice or our actions? Is there male privilege involved? Is there economic abuse and inequity and injustice? So we're in, for lack of a better word, a domestic violence, domestic abuse relationship with our own country, with our own system, whether you're talking about it from the thought of sexism or you're talking about it from the thought of racism. If you look at this power and control wheel and you think about it purely from a relationship, two parties in a relationship standpoint, where the parties are gender versus the system or race versus the system, you see where power and control is ingrained into the various systems that help suppress and oppress. So that means by extension, the same trauma that we would expect from a woman experiencing domestic violence, it is no wonder why those same traumas exist in women and people of color that are fighting and trying to survive within the system. I mean, I did a piece on medium.com too, talking about can we live? And I talked about how it's so hard to breathe, not just when a police officer has his knee on our neck, but it's hard to breathe just trying to navigate the various systems in any day where you really don't take your first breath of the day from the time you walk out of your house to the time you get in your house. And then you take a big breath before you listen to all the experiences that your children had to endure and your family had to endure during the same day. So you hold your breath again in hopes that you can rest in the evening before you start it all over again. So I just wanted to put up the wheel too, and given what Dr. Mary and what Amy said, just to kind of bring that power and control perspective in a different way.
I agree, and that accumulates. That stress accumulates, that distress accumulates, and we hopefully can find ways to break this cycle. And I know that many of you are doing this very kind of work as social workers, as nonprofit advocates. So then I guess the question is, what can we carry forward to educate others, or where's our entry point where we can change what we're doing? For me, is trying to participate in conversations in the education realm about sexism and racism and perpetuating things that we say we're against, but yet we're continuing them because we're not acknowledging who we are or our role in it. So there's a lot of information we've shared today, but is there anything that you would like to hear more about in these last few minutes, or things that you think we should consider? We've had some great comments so far. I just want to give you a chance to share either in the comments or aloud. Thinking about this in terms of our position in Worcester, how does this differ than our neighbors in Boston, or our neighbors in Fall River, or our neighbors in Pittsfield? I do work in Pittsfield as well. It's a different position because when COVID hit, when GE closed, you have different traumas that are geographically centered in a particular place, and that affects people generationally. What do we think here in Worcester we need to consider? Something that I've been thinking about, I live in Sturbridge, like I mentioned. We're a tourism-driven economy, and up until just a few days ago, we had no tourists. And so how is this going to ripple out and affect things? What do we need to do as neighbors to make sure that we're okay, that we can ride this out? Are there things that we can then maybe do better going forward? So, thank you very much. Other thoughts? Amy, what is something that you're seeing in your work?
I think that in Worcester, we're really looking at the police and the school as agents of oppression, and what can we do about that? And when you kind of were comparing Worcester to other municipalities, that was one of the things that stood out for me, that, you know, I love Worcester, and I hate to say anything bad about it, because, you know, it's like saying something bad about your family, but our city government is not reflective of the population at baseline, and they're certainly not reflective of the population's view on racism and sexism, as evidenced by how they're voting, how they're thinking about how we spend our money, which, as you said, is really about our priorities. So that's pretty important.
Is that about who's voting. We know, like, our friend Chantel ran for office, and God bless her, she put up a really good fight and very inspirational for many, and I think that's going to continue. But is it who's coming up to the polls? Is
Absolutely.
that who's not
That's a
choosing
big
to
piece
vote?
of it. There's the Worcester Regional Research Bureau put out a report about who votes in Worcester and who doesn't, and it's absolutely what you think. It's people that are much more affluent, people concentrated in one neighborhood. It's not distributed, especially in the school committee. At least with city council, there's some district representation, but that's not the case in the school committee. I mean, and you're right there with me, Mary, but like, don't get me started about the school funding and how that perpetuates inequality in every way, shape, or form. And, you know, come on. Yeah, go ahead, Tony. I love that you said we're in a domestic violence relationship with our government. That just like really hit home for me. And
She
like,
was writing that down. She was writing that down. I saw.
I think we also have to recognize the fatigue that women and also people of color have when it comes to voting. We've been running for years for office to only see we don't get the vote, our voices aren't heard. Or we get in office and we realize that because we are, for lack of a better word, the token in that position, we don't have the power of the office, even if we hold the office. And I think right now we're experiencing some fatigue where people really don't believe that voting matters, that if they go out and vote, that it's going to count. And I think we're at a stage now where it's not about convincing people only that they have to vote, but that it matters to the bigger picture, that it is an extension of your voice. Because, you know, people are saying, you know, it takes 10 minutes to vote, and people are like, I don't want to waste my time for something that doesn't matter. And I'm like, it's 10 minutes every 2 years. Like, like you can't do 10 minutes every 2 years. But it's that issue of, well, if I vote, I'm going to be mad for the next 2 years that the person I voted for didn't win or didn't listen to me anyway. But one thing I do want to say, like similar to what Amy was saying with that list, I know when I speak to any legislators or when I speak to various agencies or groups, one of the questions they ask me is, did I vote? They don't necessarily ask who you vote for, but they ask, did you vote? Because their decision making is linked to the percentages of people they vote for. And if you don't vote, I've even had politicians say, hey, I would love to do this thing. I'm passionate about this thing. But the people who would benefit from this didn't vote. So I don't have the numbers to back up my choice. So, I mean, we're kind of stuck in this circular reasoning. Like, I don't get what I want, so I'm not going to vote for what I want. And we're going to have to do something. But I just wanted to express that I do think there is some fatigue there that we're dealing with.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop, right? We've all had, my head is spinning and swirling, right? And I'm sure the audience is right there with me on that. Just again, I already thought you two were like the most amazing women ever. And like, that has definitely been reinforced. So grateful for your bravery, your honesty, your willingness to speak truth to power, your service to our state through the commission. And of course, so grateful for everyone here who tuned in. That really says a lot. That's amazing. We will make the recording available as soon as we have it. We'll put that on our Facebook page. I usually send that out a bunch. Please look into, we shared some of the links, but both Tony and Mary have written some great pieces that really have expanded my thinking on these issues. Check those out if you can. The report that the statewide commission did, I'm so proud of, and I know that my fellow commissioners agree. way to get on it and really put those issues out there. So there's lots more if you want to get more information. And again, thanks everybody so much for being here. We won't like kill the link right off the bat. So if you want to stick around and ask anything to Mary or Tony, please do. But if you've got to go because you're a Zoom fatigue and general fatigue, feel free. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Amy, for the invite. Thank you, Tony, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I did the thing. I tried not to do the thing where you're talking and not interviewing. But this was great. Thank you so much. It's always so much fun being with you today.
Thank you so much. Interesting topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Your comments were amazing.
God bless you.
You too. The faith element is always important, right? I love that she said that this is like the work she has to do. She has to know this stuff. Like, thank you.
Well, yeah, we have to bring it into all of our churches, our faith-based institutions and organizations, because those are the institutions that are there to empower, you know, whatever your faith is or is not. But I'm a Christian, and I truly believe that my faith empowers me. But if those leaders aren't talking about these issues, then they're not empowering me in every way that I need to be empowered. So it's really important that churches and religious organizations have this conversation. So I'm really glad she's here to educate herself and her members.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If I was recorded, if at all possible, I could get a copy of it, I really would appreciate
Absolutely,
it.
can.
I'll reach out to Dr. Tony, and I'll give her my information. Thank you.
Great.
God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great job.
So Kate just mentioned that we should make sure we mention the census too, not just voting. That which is true, that the financial aspect, the money, the budget is based a lot on the census. So the importance of that. So definitely don't want to overlook that, which is especially important for women and communities of color to make sure you count everybody in your household. A lot of times parents forget to count students that are away at college. Make sure you count everybody in your household and that you're accurate, and because that's how the money moves. That's how you get what you need, and that's also how you can speak out against any disparities that exist, to say, wait, the numbers are here, but the money's not here.
Right. So we need to be as accurate as possible.
Right. Thank you, Kate, for bringing that up.
Yeah, and when we looked at slide 23, this information is coming from the census and the American Community Survey. So that's, for those of us who are working in research, we rely on this kind of information, understanding that it may not be as accurate as we want. So we need something to work with. I think there are several educators here. I saw in the bios, when we're looking at poverty, we use the free and reduced lunch measure, which we know that metric is not necessarily accurate. My husband's hometown in Connecticut, Willimantic, declared everybody got free and reduced lunch. That doesn't mean the whole town's impoverished, but now this is the number that we have to work with. So to have as much good information as we can to work with, the better. But thank you for bringing that up, Kate. Yes, indeed.
All right, I guess I could just sign off, and maybe people are just waiting for us to go. Thanks again to both of you. That was really amazing. And again, we'll have all of that on, we've recorded it, we'll post it, we'll share it out on Worcester Address Childhood Trauma's Facebook page, on the Status of Women's page. Tony and Mary will both have access to share with their networks. Thank you so much to your networks for being here today. Thank you.
This is great. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you,
you.
Amy. You're amazing. Thank you.
You guys
Indeed.
too. Thank you so much. All
Have a
right,
good rest
goodbye,
of the day.
everybody. See you
Bye.
next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye.